Hello all, welcome to part 3 of this scope series. I was not really planning to do a part 3 of the video, however, the troubleshooting as part of the restoration was pretty simple. It was just a high voltage issue and I didn't get a chance to cover rest of the components inside the scope, so I thought I'll do a part 3 showing you what all parts and pieces are inside this and how is it put together. So let's get started. Unlike the last couple of videos, this time I will do a functional tour of the instrument than just doing a simple physical tour, which means I'm going to go through each of the functional blocks in the instrument and show you where is it located physically in the instrument. To do that, we need to establish some baseline from a physical orientation perspective. So I'm going to call this as the right hand side or RHS of the instrument, and this is going to be the LHS or left hand side of the instrument, and this we will call it as the top, and this side is going to be the bottom. Now let's get into the details of what is packed on each side, starting with the left hand side where the top front portion is the plug-in. Right behind that is the delay line driver stage of the vertical amplifier, and at the back is the 12.6 volt power supply section. The bottom section towards the front is the calibrator or the cal signal generator, and right behind that is the low voltage power supply and the transformer. Moving on to the right hand side of the instrument, the top section is the vertical amplifier. Again, this is the vertical amplifier post the delay line, and behind that is a portion of the CRT circuitry. And on the bottom side towards the front is time base A, which is the trigger and the time base generator or the sweep generator. Right behind that is the horizontal amplifier, and then following the horizontal amplifier is the high voltage oscillator, which is basically the oscillator, the rectifier, and the voltage multiplier section for the high voltage. Moving on to the top side, of course you can see the plug-in, the CRT, and then the big delay line, and below that is the vertical amplifier. This is the output stage of the vertical amplifier. The signal which is taken from the delay line is fed to the stage. Right on top of that is the termination for the vertical signal, which is coming out of the CRT. Now, if you open the delay line, which is hinged, you can see a few more components. On the top side is the delay line driver tubes, and right below that, the three main capacitors you see are used for 12.6 volt power supply. And you can see the vertical final output amplifier, the 7788 pair in this case. Moving on to the bottom side, this is where most of the time base B is located, which is on the door. And then you can see the tubes for the cal section, the tubes for the power supply section, and another view of the main power transformer. And also you can see the high voltage oscillator tubes. And towards the rear side, next to the fan, is the shunt resistors for the main power supply. If you open the time base B door, you can see timing capacitors, the main rectifiers for the low voltage power supply, and the current limiting resistors. Now let's get in and go through each of these sections in detail. Let's start from the case of the rack mount 585. Now here there is a major difference between rack mount and non-rack mount models, where the power connection in the rack mount comes up over here, and this is what gets connected to the actual chassis, and this is the interior of the cover, and you can see the guide pin and the power socket attached directly to the cover. This way the cover can be mounted to the rack, and then you can pull the scope out, and as you pull out the scope, the power will be disconnected. And then if you reinsert it back, it will automatically get power from the socket inside the case or cover. And this is the mating side on the actual chassis. Let's start from the left hand side of the chassis. This is going to be the wiring or the component side of the power supply section. We will see the tube side later in the video. So the power input gets fused and runs all the way to the front panel, power switch. It comes back to the main transformer right here. That's to pin number 1 and 4 in the transformer. Also, that is plugged into the fan. These two black cables, they go to the fan. Numerous outputs in the transformer. This is the main power supply test point. This is the main power supply section, the underside of it or the component side of it. You can see all the filter capacitors on the top side and the rest of the passives and tubes on the bottom side. These are the precision resistors used for supplying the reference voltage to each section. All of them refer back to the minus 150 volt regulated by the VR tube, which is 5651 in this case. This is the 12.6 volt regulator circuitry, the actives and the passives associated with it. This is completely a semiconductor stage. There are no tubes involved in the 12.6 volt regulator. This is a look at the bottom side of the chassis. And let me open this up. That's a main power transformer. These are the rectifier diodes and the current limiting resistors for every rail. And all the power supply tubes, capacitors, the main filter capacitors. Power supply shunt resistors. And if we move deep in, we can see the thermal cutout, TK601. Now let's move to the top side. This is the time delay tube, the 18NO30, and next to that is the relay. So they have used a cover for the relay in this model. This is the rectifier for the 12.6 volt power supply and the fuse. In older models or in older serial numbers, they've used selenium rectifier and this fuse was missing. And these are the filter capacitors for the 12.6 volt power supply. Let's come back to the left side again. What you see next to the power supply is the amplitude calibrator. The main amplitude calibrator control switch or the output level switch and all the resistors associated with it. And the circuitry for that sit right next to the power supply here. And these are the two tubes and the associated circuitry for the amplitude calibrator. Moving on to the next side, it's mostly the vertical circuitry. This side is the plug-in and a close-up of the plug-in circuitry. This is not part of the scope chassis. And the output of the plug-in is coming into the line driver stage. And this is the line driver stage of the distributed vertical amplifier. This is a 7-stage distributed amplifier. And the output of that goes into the delay line. The signal from the plug-in, the vertical signal, the differential signal is coming in through the red and green wire and driving the grid line. You can see the green connections. They are the transmission line driving all the grids of this 7-stage distributed amplifier, which you see right over here. The end of the grid line is terminated directly back on the plug-in. So the connections, the two coax gray cables are going back to the plug-in connector for grid line termination. Now let's move to the top side. This is the top side of the instrument. And of course we see the delay line again right here. And this is the distributed section, or the distributed vertical amplifier, so called as the line driver amplifier. And what we see here is the plate line for it. That is the connector for the plug-in. The vertical signal comes in from there. Those two are the transistors which are part of the 12.6 volt regulator, and rest all of it is the line driver for the vertical amplifier. That's how the plate line looks. That comes out of the stage and gets into the delay line. And this is the delay line. The input to the delay line comes from the delay line driver stage, goes through the delay line, and then it ends up in the final vertical output stage, which is what you see here. And this is the grid side for the vertical output amplifier. The plate side is on the other side. Let's now move to the right hand side. That is the vertical output amplifier. The red lines, one over here, there is one more on the other side of the tubes. That's the plate line for the final output amplifier. The fuse, what you see here, this one, plus there is one more out here. Those are the plate line fuses. That's another view of the plate line. This is the connection to the final vertical output tubes. This is the back side of the 7788. And then the final output tubes, a pair of 7788s whose output is driving the vertical deflection plates, or the distributed deflection plates in the CRT. Goes through the distributed deflection plates and then comes out. A closer look at the CRT. The input signal from the final power amplifier, or the 7788s, come into the CRT through those two pins, and then the beam is deflected by the distributed deflection plates, which is another delay line with individual deflection plates attached to them. And then the final output, or the last stage of the distributed deflection plate set, is connected out on those pins for connecting to the termination network, which is going to sit outside the CRT. And gets terminated into the termination network here. Close-up look at the vertical amplifier termination network. These are the CRT controls, mainly focus, intensity, astig, and screen illumination. And also you can see the connector for the CRT post deflection HV. The bulbs for graphical illumination. You can also see the CRT base connector here, and of course the cooling fan. Let's now move to the right hand side. Continuing the CRT section, the high voltage oscillator and the rectifier, voltage multiplier, and the high voltage regulator, all of them are housed towards the rear side. And on the other side is the CRT. You can see the CRT HV output going from there. Now let's look at the bottom side. The two tubes, they are the high voltage oscillator tubes. One is the regulator, the 12AU7, and then a 6AU5, which is the main oscillator tube. Let's now move to the right hand side. What you see on the bottom is the time base A, which starts right here with the trigger selection switch. A close-up of the trigger source select switch. Here is the tunnel diode used for the trigger. And continuing to the horizontal amplifier, and then the output of the horizontal amplifier moving from here to the CRT deflection plates. These are the ports for calibration. Next to that is the high voltage cage, which you've already seen. Spare silver solder. Now let's look at the bottom side. Let's look into time base A and the horizontal amplifier, which is right over here. That is the start of trigger A, or A trigger, those two tubes which you see in the front. And then the transistor next to it is the only transistor in the signal processing section of the scope. That's a trigger amplifier post the tunnel diode, and the rest of them are part of the sweep generator and the horizontal amplifier. This is the back side of the front panel. Towards the bottom of the chassis, we can see the delayed trigger multiplier port, and then the rest of the switches. And let me open this up. The timing capacitors, and this is time base B and delayed pick-off or delayed trigger pick-off circuitry. And this is the component side of time base B and delayed trigger pick-off circuitry. So that's about it, and thank you for watching.